Clara Johansson's fingernails scraped against the hardpan earth as she dragged herself through brittle grass, each movement sending fire through her swollen feet. 7 days, 7 endless days since she had slipped from her wedding bed in Silver Wash and fled into the Arizona Territory's merciless embrace. The torn remnants of her white silk wedding dress, once her stepfather's proudest purchase, now hung like burial shrouds, catching on thorns that opened fresh wounds across her arms. Her lips were cracked leather tongues, swollen thick as saddle leather from drinking muddy creek water when she could find it. The 21-year-old Norwegian immigrant who had dreamed of American prosperity now resembled something feral blonde hair matted with sage and blood-blue eyes hollowed by starvation and terror. Behind her, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats grew steadily closer, accompanied by voices that made her stomach clench with recognition. "Tracks fresh as morning dew," called Jake Morrison, his scarred voice carrying across the canyon. "Boss wants her breathing, but he didn't say how much." Clara pressed her face against the earth and bit her torn sleeve to muffle a whimper. The wedding ring on her finger, once a symbol of hope, now a golden shackle cut into her swollen flesh as she tried to crawl faster. Thunder rumbled overhead, though no clouds darkened the brutal afternoon sky. The sound came from horses, lots of them surrounding her like wolves closing on wounded prey. The irony burned in her chest like swallowed acid. In her small Norwegian village, she had treasured Silas Boone's letters, reading them aloud to her younger sisters by candlelight. "My dearest Clara," one had begun in careful script. "I seek a devoted wife to share in building a prosperous future in America's golden territories. Together, we shall cultivate both land and love, creating a legacy of happiness." The letters had painted pictures of rolling pastures, a comfortable home, children playing safely in sun-drenched gardens. She had saved every word, dreaming of escape from the grinding poverty that had claimed their father to consumption and left their mother hollow-eyed and desperate. Now she knew those letters for what they were: bait in a trap designed to snare desperate women seeking salvation. The prosperous rancher was a monster who viewed wives as livestock to be broken and bred. The comfortable home was a prison where screams went unheard and rebellion was met with fists and leather belts. The legacy of happiness was a joke told by Satan himself. Day one had been adrenaline and desperation, slipping from Boone's ranch house, while her new husband lay drunk in their marriage bed, his scarred hands still bearing traces of her blood under the fingernails. Day two brought the first taste of real hunger, as she followed deer trails through mesquite thickets, guided only by childhood memories of her grandfather's stories about reading the landscape for water and shelter. Day three. The blisters on her feet burst, leaving bloody footprints that anyone could follow. On day 4, death had come hunting in a different form. Clara had taken shelter in a shallow cave when the distinctive rattle froze her blood. A diamondback rattlesnake as thick as her arm coiled just inches from where her hand rested on the stone. She had remained motionless for what felt like hours, watching the serpent's triangular head weave hypnotically, while its tail continued that bone-chilling warning. Only when a cloud covered the sun and the cave's temperature dropped did the snake finally slither away into deeper darkness, leaving Clara shaking with the knowledge that the wilderness held death in countless forms beyond human cruelty. Day 5 had brought different terrors. The sound of approaching voices forced her to squeeze beneath a fallen Joshua tree, pressing her face into thorny earth, while a group of Mexican bandits rode past their conversation, filled with casual references to women they had captured and sold. She had held her breath until her lungs burned, understanding that these men would view her as valuable merchandise, regardless of her existing predicament. When their voices finally faded, she had remained hidden until full darkness, too frightened to trust that they hadn't left someone behind to watch for movement. By day 6, she was drinking her own urine to survive, having learned the desperate trick from a Norwegian fisherman's wife, whose ship had been wrecked in a storm during Clara's childhood. The woman had survived 14 days on a rocky outcropping before rescue came, sustained by rainwater and techniques that civilized people preferred not to discuss. Clara's mother had whispered the story as a cautionary tale about the lengths to which people would go to survive. Now it was keeping her alive in a desert that seemed determined to claim her bones. Now, on the 7th day, her body was failing completely. She tried to rise, but her legs buckled, sending her crashing back to the dirt. This was how it would end, dragged back to face whatever punishment Boone had devised for his runaway bride. She thought of Annie, his 15-year-old daughter, who had whispered warnings about her father's temper, and of the other women in town who kept their eyes downcast and their voices silent, understanding that survival depended on invisibility. A shadow fell across her face. Clara looked up, expecting to see Morrison's cruel grin or Tom Bradley's ham-sized fists. Instead, she stared into the dark eyes of an Apache warrior. Kohana emerged from the red rocks like a desert spirit, his muscular frame marked with white and red war paint across his chest, protection symbols his people used before dangerous journeys. He moved with the fluid silence of a Predator Winchester rifle held with casual competence that spoke of countless battles survived. His face showed 30 years of harsh desert living, but his eyes held depths of grief that Clara recognized from her own mirror. For a moment, memory transported him backward through seasons of loss to a different time when laughter had echoed through his lodge, and small hands had tugged at his buckskin shirt. Ayanna had been grinding corn that morning, her long black hair catching sunlight that streamed through the lodge opening while their 3-year-old son had played with carved wooden horses near the fire. "Teach me to track rabbits today, Father," the boy had demanded with the fierce determination that marked him as a true warrior's child. Kohana had lifted him onto his shoulders, promising that today they would learn to read the Earth's secret language. But the trading journey with the Navajo had called, and he had left with promises to teach tracking skills when the snows melted. He had returned to graves and ashes his family claimed by fever that left their bodies burning with heat that no medicine could cool. The other survivors spoke in whispers of the diseased cattle that had grazed their valley animals, bearing Silas Boone's brand and spreading death wherever they wandered. Ayanna had tended the sick until the fever took her to dying with their son's name on her lips, while Kohana rode distant trails, unaware that his world was ending one breath at a time. Now this broken white woman lay before him, another victim of the same system that had destroyed his family. The irony was not lost on him. The race that had taken everything from his people had also produced this shattered creature fleeing the same evil that had poisoned his loved ones. But suffering was suffering, and honor demanded he protect the innocent regardless of their skin color. Without speaking, he knelt beside her collapsed form and uncapped his water canteen. The liquid was warm but clean, flowing past her parched lips like salvation itself. Clara drank greedily, feeling strength return to her trembling limbs with each precious swallow. When she had drunk her fill, Kohana's calloused fingers examined her swollen feet with the gentle precision of someone who understood wounds both physical and spiritual. "You run from evil, man," he said in careful English, his accent thick but understandable. "Evil follow like hungry wolf, never rest, never stop. But wolf can be killed if prey becomes hunter." Clara stared at him through eyes that had forgotten how to hope. "I don't know how to be a hunter. I only know how to run and hide." "Then you learn," Kohana replied simply, "or you die. Desert teach hard lessons, but strong spirits survive to teach others." The approaching riders grew louder. Morrison's voice sharp with frustration, Bradley's deeper rumble discussing what they'd do when they caught her. Kohana's jaw tightened as he listened, recognizing voices of men who worked for the rancher responsible for his family's death. The symmetry felt like divine providence, offering him the chance to strike back at his enemies while protecting someone who shared his suffering. In 1877, the Arizona Territory remained a lawless frontier where powerful men ruled through intimidation and violence. Territorial law existed mainly on paper, while real authority belonged to whoever commanded the most guns and the will to use them without mercy. Silas Boone had spent 15 years building his empire of fear, controlling Silver Wash through bribed officials and hired killers who enforced his will without question or conscience. Clara had arrived 3 months earlier on a dusty stagecoach, clutching the letters that had promised her a prosperous husband seeking a devoted wife. Instead, she found a 43-year-old monster with scarred hands and cold eyes, who viewed her as livestock purchased for breeding. On their wedding night, when she had trembled and begged for gentleness, Boone had backhanded her across the mouth and torn her dress with savage efficiency that spoke of long practice. "You belong to me now." He had snarled, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey and decay. "Best learn that quick Norwegian cow. I paid good money for you, and I intend to get my investment back with interest." The beating that followed left her ribs purple with bruises and her spirit shattered, but it also ignited something fierce inside her, the determination to escape or die in the attempt. She had endured 1 week of daily brutality, learning to read the signs of his approaching rages and finding hiding places when his fists grew too eager, before stealing away in the pre-dawn darkness with only a water canteen and the clothes on her back. Kohana carried his own burden of grief and rage that had sustained him through months of solitary hunting. Returning from a winter trading journey with the Navajo, he had discovered Boone's diseased cattle grazing in his people's sacred valley, fouling streams where generations had gathered medicine plants and performed ceremonies that connected them to the spirit world. The fever those animals carried swept through his village like wildfire, claiming dozens of lives, including the 2 people who gave his existence meaning and purpose. Now this broken white woman lay before him, another victim of the same system that had destroyed his family. Kohana made his choice with the certainty of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. He would protect her, not from kindness, but from justice, the knowledge that some evils demanded opposition, regardless of personal cost or tribal allegiances. Other players moved through Silver Wash like pieces on a deadly chessboard, each carrying their own motivations and secrets. Father McNulty numbed his guilt over the town's violence with whiskey and poker games that left him drowning in debt to Boone. Despite his weakness, the priest still felt called to help abused women, though Boone's financial leverage kept him mostly silent and ineffective. Santiago Rivera worked as Boone's tracker, hunting runaway wives and debtors to feed his own family. But the job corroded his conscience, especially since his beloved daughter Isabella was 15, the same age as Boone's child, making him uncomfortably aware of the parallels between his employer's cruelty and his own complicity. And Annie Boone herself lived in constant terror of her father's explosive rages, while secretly documenting his crimes in a leather journal hidden beneath her bedroom floorboards. Just 2 nights earlier, she had crouched behind her door, listening to her father beat a Mexican woman who had refused his advances, the sound of fists on flesh mixing with pleas for mercy in 2 languages. When silence finally fell, Annie had lit her candle and written carefully. September 12th, 1877. Papa beat Maria Consuela until she could not stand. She tried to crawl away, but he dragged her back by her hair. "I think he will kill her tomorrow, like he killed the others." The girl dreamed of escape and justice, carefully recording names, dates, and descriptions of every beating, every murder, every woman who disappeared after crossing her father's twisted desires. Her meticulous records would eventually provide the evidence needed to destroy his empire if she could find someone brave enough to act on the information. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the ridge where Clara lay, gasping. She heard spurs jingling as men dismounted, their voices carrying clearly in the desert air that seemed to amplify sound rather than muffle it. "Well, well." Morrison's voice came from directly above her. "Look what we found, crawling in the dirt like a wounded animal." Clara looked up to see 2 men standing on the boulder rifles pointed down at her head with casual malice. Morrison was tall and lean with a knife scar across his cheek from an old prison fight, while Bradley was built like a bull, with hands that could crush bones and a reputation for enjoying the process. Both wore expressions of predatory satisfaction that promised she would regret being found alive. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible through cracked lips. "I'll come back willingly. Just give me water first." "You'll come back either way," Bradley said, jumping down from the rock with surprising grace for his bulk. "Question is whether you ride proper-like or get dragged behind my horse like a sack of grain." Boss didn't specify which he preferred. Morrison remained alert, scanning the surrounding terrain, with the caution of a survivor who had lived through numerous ambushes. Movement flickered in his peripheral vision shadow, where no shadow should exist among the red rocks. He swung his rifle toward the disturbance just as an arrow sprouted from his chest, the steel point punching through his ribcage with surgical precision that spoke of a master archer. Morrison toppled backward off the boulder, finger pulling the trigger reflexively and sending a wild shot echoing through the canyon. Bradley spun around with surprising speed for his bulk, but a second arrow took him in the shoulder and spun him to the ground, bellowing curses and pain while blood spread across his shirt. Kohana stepped from behind mesquite cover bow, already fitted with a third arrow, nocked and ready to fly. He had been stalking these men since dawn, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, when they would be most vulnerable. The woman's presence complicated matters, but her obvious distress and their cruel intentions made his choice clear. "Apache devil!" Bradley roared, struggling to raise his rifle with his good arm, while his wounded shoulder streamed blood. Kohana's third shot took Bradley in the thigh, dropping him completely and ending any threat he might have posed. The warrior approached Clara with measured steps, dark eyes assessing her condition with practiced skill gained from years of treating battle wounds and exhaustion. She stared up at him in shock, unable to process that salvation had arrived in such an unexpected form. "Can you ride?" he asked in careful English, his accent thick but understandable. Clara shook her head weakly. "I can barely stand." Without hesitation, Kohana lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she had become after 7 days of starvation and dehydration. He carried her to his paint mare, a sturdy horse trained for silence and endurance in hostile territory. While behind them, Bradley continued shouting threats that would bring more riders soon enough. As they rode into the gathering dusk, Clara looked back at the wounded men and realized her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a runaway wife, but a woman allied with Apache warriors against territorial authority. The fact that Kohana had saved her life would mean nothing to men like Boone, who offered bounties for Apache scalps and justified any revenge through claims of savage violence against innocent settlers. But cradled in the arms of a man who had risked everything to protect a complete stranger, Clara felt something she had not experienced since leaving Norway Hope. Dawn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, as Kohana guided his horse through narrow ravines, constantly alert for signs of pursuit. Clara's strength was slowly returning with food and water from his supplies, though her feet remained too damaged for walking on the rocky terrain. The Apache warrior had wrapped them in strips torn from his shirt, stopping the bleeding, but unable to ease the deep pain of 7 days' desperate flight over sharp stones and thorny ground. They had ridden through the night, following paths that only desert-born eyes could navigate in darkness, guided by stars and subtle landmarks invisible to most travelers. Kohana knew these canyons intimately. Every hidden spring, every defensible position, every trail that might conceal their passage from skilled trackers. But he also understood that Boone would not abandon the chase easily, and that Santiago Rivera possessed tracking abilities that rivaled his own hard-won knowledge. "You learned to read the desert," Kohana said as he dismounted to check for signs of their pursuers. "Water leaves marks on stone, animals make paths that lead to safety. Even in emptiness, life finds a way." Clara watched him examine the ground, with fingers that seemed to read stories in dust and displaced pebbles. "How do you know so much?" 30 winters in this place," he replied, his voice carrying undertones of loss. Learn or die, no middle ground. My father taught me, his father taught him. Knowledge passed down like sacred fire, never allowed to die. Your father, is he gone? Soldiers came when I was young. Man said we must live on reservation, eat government beef, send children to schools that kill the spirit. Some fought, some ran, some died. He chose to die rather than watch his people become strangers to themselves. Clara felt the weight of his words, understanding that she was not the only one who had lost everything to forces beyond her control. I'm sorry. I never thought. Back in Norway, we heard stories about Indians, but never about families, about children who lost their fathers. Kohana glanced at her with something approaching surprise. Few white women had ever acknowledged Apache humanity, much less expressed sympathy for their losses. Your people have their own sorrows. Sometimes suffering teaches wisdom, sometimes only bitterness. You choose which lesson to learn. They continued riding as the sun climbed higher, sharing water from his canteen and pieces of dried meat that tasted like salvation to Clara's starved body. Gradually, she found herself telling him about her family in Norway, the consumption that had claimed her father, the desperate poverty that had driven her stepfather to accept Boone's marriage proposal, the sisters she had left behind, with promises to send money for their passage to America. I thought I was saving them, she said quietly. Thought I was being brave, sacrificing for their future. But I was just running away from one kind of suffering into another. No, Kohana replied firmly. You were hunted by lies, caught in trap made by evil man. Rabbit who flees hawk is not coward, is survivor trying to live another day. Sometimes running toward danger is only way to escape it. Our water ahead, he added, pointing toward a gap between towering sandstone formations. Rio Salado runs deep here. Good for crossing, bad for following with dogs. Clara nodded despite her dread of entering cold water in her weakened condition. She had nearly drowned as a child in Norway, falling through pond ice during a harsh winter when she had been playing too close to the edge. The memory of water filling her lungs and darkness closing over her head still haunted her dreams with icy terror. The Rio Salado flowed swift and muddy between rocky banks, swollen by recent mountain rains that had turned the normally shallow crossing into a treacherous torrent. Kohana dismounted and helped Clara from the saddle, her legs trembling as she gripped his shoulders for support. He could feel exhaustion radiating from her body like heat from sun-baked stone. Hold tight, he instructed, lifting her again with gentle strength. Water is cold, current strong. Do not let go no matter what happens. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck as he waded into the river, his horse following with trained obedience, born of countless dangerous crossings. The current proved stronger than expected, tugging at their bodies and threatening to sweep them toward rapids visible downstream, where white water crashed over jagged rocks. Halfway across, water reached Kohana's chest, and Clara felt icy liquid soaking through her torn dress, stealing what warmth remained in her battered body. Numbness spread through her fingers as her grip began to slip, and the river seemed to pull at her with malevolent intelligence that reminded her of childhood nightmares. Suddenly, she was 8 years old again, sinking through dark water while ice formed above her head, like a crystal ceiling that blocked all hope of rescue. Panic seized her throat as muddy water splashed over her face, and she began to struggle against Kohana's hold. Clara. His voice cut through her terror like a blade through silk. Stay with me. You are not that frightened child anymore. You are a woman who survived 7 days alone in desert. River cannot claim what belongs to the living. She forced her eyes open and saw his face above hers, determined, fierce, absolutely certain, and they would survive this crossing together. His arm tightened around her waist with strength that defied the river's persistent hunger and fighting as when they reached the far bank, where Kohana quickly built a small fire to warm her shivering form. As Clara huddled near the flames wrapped in his blanket, gunshots echoed across the water. 3 riders appeared on the opposite bank, Santiago Rivera, and 2 of Boone's men rifles already drawn and seeking targets through the morning mist. "There," one shouted. "Apache has the woman." Bullets whistled across the water, striking mud near their fire and sending up sprays of wet earth that spattered their faces with grit. Kohana grabbed his Winchester and pushed Clara behind a boulder, using his body to shield her from the gunfire that seemed to come from all directions. Across the river, Santiago Rivera sat his horse with obvious reluctance, his weathered face troubled as he watched his companions fire at the fleeing woman and her protector. The previous night, he had stared at the muddy footprints they had been following, small delicate tracks that spoke of desperation and pain, leaving traces of blood on rocks where damaged feet had struggled to find purchase. The sight had reminded him of his own daughter Isabella, barely 15 and full of dreams about the future, and he had wondered what kind of man he had become, that he would hunt down someone's child for money. "Give us the woman, Apache," Rivera called, though his heart was no longer in the chase. "You have no quarrel with us. Your boss makes quarrel with my people." Kohana replied, sighting down his rifle barrel with deadly precision. "His cattle poison sacred water, spread death to our children. Now he sends dogs to hunt innocent women like wounded deer." Another volley rang out, one bullet grazing Kohana's left arm and leaving a bloody furrow in the muscle. He ignored the pain and returned fire, his shot catching one rider in the shoulder and tumbling him from his saddle into the shallow water where current began dragging him downstream toward the rocks. Rivera helped rescue the wounded man, then called across the water again. "Boss won't stop hunting her, Apache. You know this truth. Save yourself trouble, bring her back, and ride away free. She goes where her heart chooses," Kohana replied, ejecting the spent cartridge with practiced efficiency. "Free woman makes own path, follows own spirit. No man owns another's dreams." The remaining gunman raised his rifle for another shot, but Rivera knocked the barrel aside with his hand, his conscience finally overruling his loyalty to Boone's gold. Clara watched this exchange with growing hope. Perhaps not all of her husband's men were willing to participate in her murder. After a few more ineffective shots across the wide river, the riders withdrew to find another crossing point. Kohana knew they would circle around and pick up the trail within hours, but the delay provided time to bandage his wound and allow Clara to regain some strength. As he cleaned the bullet graze with water from the river, Clara tore strips from her already ruined dress to make bandages. Her fingers worked with surprising skill, and Kohana found himself studying her face as she concentrated on the task. "You have healing hands," he observed. "This is gift from spirits, not something that can be taught. My mother was a midwife," Clara replied, carefully wrapping the wound. "I helped her deliver babies, tend the sick. She always said healing comes from the heart, not just the hands. Your mother was wise, woman. Healing and killing both come from same place inside the will to change what is. You choose which power to use." Clara paused in her bandaging, struck by the truth of his words. "Why are you helping me? Your people and mine are supposed to be enemies, according to territorial law." Kohana looked at her with eyes that held depths of loss she was only beginning to understand. "Enemy is man who takes what belongs to others without honor," he said quietly. "Who destroys for pleasure, who spreads death like poison seed. Your husband is my enemy. You are just woman seeking freedom from cage, same as any bird that fights the trap. But I'm white. Doesn't that matter to you? Color of skin does not make heart." Kohana replied simply. "Evil and good come in all colors, wear all faces. I judge by actions, not appearance." In the distance, they could hear dogs barking as Boone's hunting party regrouped and began searching for a river crossing. The chase was accelerating toward its inevitable climax, and both Clara and Kohana understood that their alliance had transformed them into more valuable prey in the deadly game now being played across the Arizona territory. But something had changed during their conversation by the river. What had begun as a practical alliance between desperate strangers was evolving into something deeper, a connection based on shared suffering and mutual respect that transcended the racial hatred defining territorial politics. The abandoned mining camp, squatted in a box canyon like the bones of some massive desert creature, its weathered buildings bleached white by years of unforgiving sun and sand-laden winds. Clara followed Kohana through the debris of broken dreams, rusted equipment that had once promised wealth, empty whiskey bottles that had drowned disappointment, and cold ashes from campfires that had burned out months ago when the last prospector finally admitted defeat. Her feet, though bandaged, sent sharp pains up her legs with each step, but she refused to slow their pace. The sound of pursuit had grown closer throughout the morning, and she could feel the invisible net tightening around them like a noose prepared for hanging. Men came here seeking gold in the earth. Kohana observed, examining the entrance to a played-out mine shaft that descended into darkness. Found only hard rock and broken promises. Like your marriage, yes. Beautiful words, hiding ugly truth. Clara nodded, understanding the bitter parallel between her own deception and the lies that had lured desperate men to die in these empty holes. She too had traveled west, seeking treasure-love security, a chance to build something meaningful with a partner who claimed to value her. Instead, she had found violence and imprisonment, forcing her to flee into wilderness that seemed determined to claim her bones for its own collection. Fresh signs of recent habitation marked one of the larger buildings, warm ashes in the fireplace, empty food tins, with labels still legible, and bloodstains on wooden floors that made Clara's stomach clench with sick recognition. Someone had been badly injured here, and the amount of blood suggested they might not have survived their wounds. "Hello," a weak voice called from shadowed corners. "Please don't shoot. I'm not armed, not dangerous." Kohana raised his rifle, while Clara peered past an overturned table that had been used as a barricade. A man emerged slowly, with hands raised, his shirt soaked with blood from a wound in his side that had been crudely bandaged with torn cloth. Perhaps 40 years old, with calloused working hands and hollow eyes that spoke of devastating loss and long pain. "Name's Jeb Calloway," the wounded man said, swaying on his feet, but maintaining dignity despite his desperate circumstances. "Been hiding here 4 days since Boone's men shot me down like a dog in the street. You folks carrying any medical supplies by chance?" Clara immediately moved to help him sit her nursing instincts, overriding caution as she recognized signs of serious injury. She had cared for younger siblings through various illnesses in Norway, and though no trained doctor, she could see that infection was setting into Jeb's wound. The bullet had passed clean through his side, but dirt and debris had contaminated the injury, causing dangerous inflammation that could kill him within days. "Boone murdered my brother Tom," Jeb continued as Clara examined his wound with gentle fingers that probed for damaged organs. "Shot him down in Silverwash's main street for refusing to sell our family land. Said Tom was resisting lawful seizure for debts we never owed, but everyone knew it was just theft with legal papers attached. When I tried to protest to the sheriff, Boone's men came hunting me too." Kohana listened with growing anger that burned like coals in his chest. Each tale of Boone's brutality added fuel to hatred that had sustained him through months of grief over his family's death. He rummaged through their meager supplies, finding clean cloth and a small bottle of whiskey that could serve as disinfectant. As Clara cleaned and bandaged Jeb's wound with careful precision, she felt confidence growing in abilities she had almost forgotten she possessed. For 7 days, she had been nothing but prey, running from predators with only terror guiding her actions. Now caring for this wounded stranger who had also suffered under Boone's tyranny, she remembered she was more than a victim. A woman with skills, intelligence, and strength to help others despite her own desperate circumstances. "Can you travel?" Kohana asked once the bandaging was complete. "Boone's men follow like hunting wolves. This place offers no protection when they arrive with guns and fire." Jeb tested his mobility, wincing, but managing to stay upright through sheer determination. "I can manage if we take it slow." Been thinking about Tucson, where Boone doesn't own every judge and lawman yet. They gathered useful supplies from the camp, preserved food that would keep them alive, ammunition for Kohana's rifle, and an old hunting knife that Clara tucked into her dress for protection. The blade felt foreign in her hand, but she remembered Rivera's advice about choosing between healing and killing, understanding that sometimes survival required embracing both powers. As they prepared to leave, thunder began rumbling in the southern mountains, and dark clouds gathered with the ominous speed that characterized desert weather. The air grew thick with electricity that made their skin prickle and their horses nervous. The storm struck 2 hours later with sudden violence that transformed the landscape into a battlefield between earth and sky. Rain fell in sheets that turned dry earth into treacherous mud, while lightning struck rocky peaks with explosive force that echoed like cannon fire. They took shelter under a red stone overhang, but wind-driven rain soaked through their clothes and chilled them to the bone. "Fire!" Clara shouted, pointing to lightning that had ignited dry grass on a nearby hillside. "It's spreading faster than horses can run." The wildfire raced down the slope with terrifying speed, driven by wind and fed by years of accumulated brush that exploded into flame like gunpowder. Smoke began filling their shelter, making breathing difficult and forcing them back into the storm, where rain mixed with ash to create a gray paste that clung to everything. Clara's asthma, a condition that had plagued her since childhood exposure to coal dust in Norwegian mining towns, began constricting her airways as acrid smoke triggered painful spasms in her lungs. She doubled over, gasping for air that seemed to burn her throat and chest, each breath a struggle against tightening passages that refused to function properly. Kohana immediately recognized the danger, having seen similar breathing sickness in tribal elders who were vulnerable to smoke and dust during the dry seasons. Without hesitation, he lifted Clara into his arms and began running toward cleaner air, with Jeb limping behind despite his wound and the fire's advancing wall of heat. Burning embers fell around them like hellish snow as they fled the advancing inferno. Clara fought for each breath, her vision darkening at the edges as her lungs refused to function properly. She felt Kohana's powerful arms supporting her weight, his voice urging her to maintain consciousness. But the world seemed to slip away into smoky darkness that promised release from struggle. "Now breathe slowly," Kohana commanded as they reached clearer air. "Small breaths do not fight the tightness. Your body knows how to heal, trust it." They reached a stream just as Clara's breathing began to ease slightly. Kohana splashed cold water on her face and chest, washing away soot and cooling her overheated body. Slowly, painfully, she regained the ability to draw fuller breaths, though her throat remained raw and her chest ached with each inhalation. "But better now?" Kohana asked, concern evident, despite his efforts to maintain the stoic composure that Apache warriors cultivated in times of crisis. Clara nodded weakly, grateful beyond words for his quick thinking and gentle care. She was beginning to understand that this Apache warrior, whom her husband's people would call a savage enemy without hesitation, possessed more humanity and compassion than any of the civilized men she had encountered since arriving in America, with dreams of prosperity and love. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Life saves itself," Kohana replied. "I only helped remove obstacles. Strong spirit finds way to survive even when body fails." As the storm passed and fire burned itself out against rocky canyon walls that served as natural fire breaks, they continued their journey under clearing skies that revealed stars emerging like scattered diamonds. But Clara noticed Kohana frequently checking their back trail, his expression growing more troubled with each passing hour. When she asked what worried him, he pointed to muddy ground where their footprints showed clearly in soft earth. "Rain washed away old tracks, but makes new ones easy to follow," he explained grimly. "Dogs will find us faster now that scent trail is fresh and strong." As if summoned by his words, distant baying echoed through the canyon behind them, closer than the hounds had been since their river crossing. Boone had expanded his hunting party and brought additional tracking dogs determined to recapture his escaped bride, regardless of cost in time, money, or men's lives. The chase that began 7 days ago was entering its most dangerous phase, with hunters closing distance and nowhere left to run. But Clara no longer felt like the broken woman who had collapsed in grass what seemed like a lifetime ago. She gripped the hunting knife at her side, drawing strength from its solid weight and the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her fight for freedom. Whatever came next, she would face it as a fighter rather than a victim standing beside unlikely allies who had shown her what true courage looked like when confronting overwhelming odds with nothing but determination and the will to survive. The Rio Grande crossing lay ahead, like a promise of safety, its muddy waters marking the boundary between Boone's immediate territory and the wider world beyond his reach. Clara Kohana and wounded Jeb Calloway had pushed through the night to reach this point, driven by increasingly close sounds of barking dogs and knowledge that their pursuers now numbered at least a dozen armed men, riding with the fury of a mob seeking blood. Clara's breathing had improved since escaping the wildfire, but her strength remained limited by days of starvation and stress, forcing her to lean heavily on Kohana's arm as they approached the riverbank. The water ran deeper here than at their previous crossing, swollen by recent rains that had turned the normally manageable stream into a dangerous torrent, and the current looked treacherous even for someone in perfect health. "Once we cross, we're in different county," Jeb said hopefully, despite pain from his wound that left him pale and shaking. "Boone has less influence with territorial law over there. Maybe we can find an honest sheriff who isn't on his payroll." Kohana studied the far bank with experienced eyes that automatically cataloged defensive positions and escape routes, warrior training that had kept him alive through countless battles with soldiers' rival tribes and hostile settlers. But something about the terrain bothered him, an instinctive warning that made his scalp prickle with danger. The opposite shore was too open for natural concealment, yet perfect for ambush if enemies had already positioned themselves with patience and skill. His instincts proved accurate with devastating precision. As they stepped into the shallows, testing the current's strength, gunfire erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the river, like thunder from a clear sky. Santiago Rivera emerged from behind boulder clusters with obvious reluctance, rifle trained on Kohana, but wavering as if he questioned his own actions, while 5 other men took positions that cut off all retreat routes with military precision. They had been outflanked and surrounded by trackers who knew this country as well as Kohana did, men who had spent hours preparing this trap, while their prey struggled through wilderness toward what they believed was safety. End of the trail, Apache. Rivera called, though Clara detected reluctance in his voice that spoke of internal conflict. "Miss Clara, your husband wants you home safe and sound. He's willing to forget this whole business if you come peaceful-like." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she saw the impossibility of their situation with crystal clarity. Behind them, dogs and additional riders were closing in, fast, their voices audible over the sound of rushing water. Ahead lay armed men with clear fields of fire and no cover except what the riverbank provided. To either side stretched open ground that offered no concealment from expert marksmen who had grown up hunting both animals and men. "Tell him I'd rather die free than live as his property," Clara called back, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice and the steel that had replaced earlier terror. Kohana stepped protectively in front of her rifle, ready but outnumbered 6-1 in a tactical situation that offered no advantages. He had survived many desperate fights through cunning and courage, but this trap had been laid with professional skill that left little room for clever escapes or heroic charges. His only realistic option was sacrifice, drawing their fire to give Clara a chance to escape in the confusion that would follow his death. It was not a glorious ending, but it would serve honor and perhaps allow her to reach safety in the chaos. "You run when shooting starts," he murmured without taking his eyes off their enemies. Follow river south, stay in water to hide scent from tracking hounds. Do not stop until you reach town with honest law. I won't abandon you. Clara whispered back, but she could see in his expression that he had already accepted likely death as the necessary price of her freedom. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Silas Boone's personal arrival, riding hard, with 4 more armed men and a pack of hunting dogs straining at their leashes with bloodlust. Clara's husband looked exactly as she remembered from their wedding day, scarred hands gripping reins with casual strength, cold eyes that showed no mercy to anyone who crossed his will, and the arrogant posture of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted by force. "Well now," Boone said, dismounting with deliberate slowness that emphasized his complete control of the situation. "Look what my dogs dragged up from the desert. A runaway wife and her savage protector caught like rats in a trap." He approached the river with confidence born of inevitable victory, his men keeping weapons trained on the trapped trio while he walked to the water's edge. Close enough that Clara could see the wedding ring still gleaming on his scarred knuckle, the same ring he had forced onto her finger while speaking vows that had turned to lies before the words finished echoing in the church. "Clara, darling," he said with false sweetness that dripped from his voice like honey from a broken comb. "You've led me quite a chase across half the territory. Cost me considerable time and money hunting you down like some wild animal. That debt's going to have to be paid in full with interest, you understand. I'm not going back with you." Clara stated, though her voice trembled slightly with the effort of maintaining defiance in the face of overwhelming force. "I know what you really are, Silas Boone." Boone laughed, a sound like gravel rattling in a tin can devoid of any human warmth. "You know what I am. You don't know anything, you stupid Norwegian cow. But you're about to receive a complete education in the consequences of defying your husband's rightful authority." He gestured toward Kohana with casual malice that spoke of countless similar scenes. "This Apache scum has been stealing cattle from honest ranchers, burning out peaceful settlers, murdering innocent women and children in their beds. I'm going to hang him right here as a warning to his savage people, and you're going to watch every second of his death. Then we'll ride home and discuss how proper wives should behave toward their husbands." Clara felt sick, realizing Boone intended to execute Kohana as a public demonstration of his power, using murder to terrorize her into absolute submission. But before she could speak, Santiago Rivera stepped forward, his weathered face troubled by conflicts that had been eating at his soul for months. "No, boss," Rivera said carefully. "Maybe we should just take the woman and ride out fast. Killing the Apache here might bring his whole tribe down on our heads, like angry hornets seeking revenge. You questioning my orders, Rivera." Boone's voice turned dangerous as winter wind carrying threats that had silenced braver men than the Mexican tracker. Rivera hesitated for a long moment, internal struggle visible on his lined face, then shook his head in apparent submission. But as he did, he deliberately dropped a small leather journal from inside his jacket, letting it fall near Clara's feet in the shallow water, where only she could see it clearly. The movement was so subtle that only the most careful observer would notice. And their eyes met for just a moment, long enough for her to see the urgent message he was desperately trying to convey. Clara bent as if stumbling from exhaustion and palmed the journal, tucking it inside her torn dress before anyone else could notice the exchange. The leather was worn smooth by constant handling, and she could feel the bulk of many pages filled with careful writing. Whatever this book contained, Rivera had taken considerable risk getting it to her, possibly signing his own death warrant in the process. "String him up," Boone ordered, pointing at a sturdy cottonwood near the riverbank, whose branches would support a man's weight. "Use that rope from my saddle horn. Make sure the Apache stays conscious for as long as possible. I want him to appreciate the full experience of justice." 2 of his men moved to grab Kohana, but the warrior wasn't finished fighting for his life and Clara's freedom. He swung his rifle butt into the first man's jaw with bone-crushing force, dropping him instantly to the muddy ground, then dove for cover behind a fallen log as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Clara threw herself flat in the mud as bullets whined overhead, like angry wasps, her hand clutching the mysterious journal that might hold keys to understanding Rivera's desperate gamble. The leather felt warm against her skin, as if it contained fire that could burn down Boone's entire empire if properly unleashed. The fight was brief, but vicious, lasting perhaps 30 seconds of concentrated violence. Kohana managed to wound one more attacker before a rifle butt struck him behind the ear, dropping him unconscious to the ground, where blood from his scalp mixed with river mud. Jeb tried to help, but collapsed from blood loss as his wound reopened under the strain of sudden movement. Clara found herself seized by rough hands and dragged from the water dress, muddy and torn, but the journal still hidden against her racing heart. Tie the Apache to that tree. Boone commanded, his face flushed with victory and anticipation. I want him awake when the noose goes around his neck. As for you, darling wife. He grabbed Clara's chin with bruising force, turning her face toward his, so she could see the hatred burning in his cold eyes. You'll watch every second of his death. Then we'll have a very long discussion about wifely obedience and the price of defiance. As Kohana was bound and prepared for execution, Clara managed to work one hand inside her dress and feel the journal's leather cover. Whatever secrets it contained represented her only remaining weapon against the monster who had destroyed so many lives across the territory. But first she had to find a way to save the Apache warrior who had risked everything to protect her, and time was running desperately short with each passing heartbeat. Kohana's consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by rough hemp around his wrists and the jeers of Boone's men preparing his execution with obvious relish. His arms had been bound behind his back and secured to the thick trunk of the cottonwood tree, while a noose dangled from a sturdy branch overhead, a makeshift gallows designed to serve Boone's dual purposes of murder and psychological terrorism. Clara knelt in mud nearby, held at gunpoint by one of the rancher's men, while Boone himself supervised hanging preparations with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed inflicting suffering on others. Her blue dress was filthy and torn beyond repair, but her eyes burned with defiance that hadn't existed when Kohana first found her collapsed and broken in the wilderness days earlier. Rivera's journal remained hidden inside her bodice, pressed against her racing heart, like a secret weapon waiting for the perfect moment to be deployed with maximum effect. Now good you're awake, Boone said, noticing Kohana's return to consciousness. Wouldn't want you to miss your own execution, savage. This is what happens to anyone who interferes with my property and threatens the natural order of civilized society. Jeb Calloway lay unconscious nearby, bleeding from his reopened wound and breathing with the shallow rhythm of a man whose body was failing under accumulated stress. Of their small group of unlikely allies, only Clara remained fully aware and able to act, but she was surrounded by armed men who would kill her without hesitation if she made any threatening move. But Clara had learned much about survival and strategy during her week in the wilderness, lessons taught by fear and desperation that no schoolroom could provide. She understood now that sometimes the most dangerous weapon was not a gun or knife, but information wielded at precisely the right moment to create maximum chaos among enemies. Before you hang him, Clara said, her voice cutting through the riverside tension like a blade through silk. There's something you need to know about what your daughter has been writing in her secret journal. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Boone spun toward her, his face draining of color like water from a broken bucket, while several of his men exchanged worried glances that spoke of shared guilt. Santiago Rivera, standing with a hanging rope in his hands, froze completely, as if turned to stone. What the hell are you talking about? Boone demanded, but Clara could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice like poison spreading through water. Clara pulled the leather journal from inside her dress, with deliberate slowness, holding it up so everyone could see the worn cover that promised damaging revelations. Annie's been keeping detailed records of everything you've done, Papa. Every murder, every beating, every crime you've committed over the past 5 years. She opened the journal to a page marked with a piece of cloth, her eyes scanning Annie's careful handwriting, including some very interesting information about your business partnerships and how you've been cheating your own men. Boone's face went from pale to flushed with rage that threatened to choke him. "Give me that book right now, or I'll put a bullet through the Apache's head before I hang him proper. You should hear this first." Clara continued, her voice growing stronger as she sensed the psychological advantage shifting in her favor. March 15th, 1876. Papa told Jake Morrison that he'd split the Calloway brothers' land 50-50 after he had them killed for their supposed debts. But I saw him sign papers giving it all to the railroad company for cash payment. Morrison thinks he's getting half that property when he's really getting nothing but lies. Jake Morrison, who had been standing guard with his rifle ready, turned slowly toward Boone with the careful movement of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. "What's she talking about, boss?" "You said that land would be mine once we took care of the Callaways. Been waiting 3 months for you to make good on that promise." "Don't listen to her lies." Boone snapped, but sweat had appeared on his forehead despite the cool riverside air. "That journal is full of a crazy girl's fantasies and childish misunderstandings." Clara continued reading in a clear voice that carried to every man present her confidence growing, as she watched doubt spread among Boone's followers like plague through a crowded town. April 2nd. Papa and Tom Bradley made a deal to share money from selling those Mexican women to the mining camps, but Papa kept all the gold for himself. Bradley still thinks his cut is coming later when the next shipment arrives. Tom Bradley's scarred face darkened with suspicion and growing anger. "Boss, what about my money from them women? You said next month for sure, been saying that for half a year now." "She's lying," Boone shouted, but his voice cracked slightly under the strain of maintaining control. "That book is full of made-up stories designed to turn you against me." May 23rd. Clara read on, her voice steady and relentless. "Papa told Rivera his daughter would be safe in town while he worked for us, but I heard him tell Morrison to burn out Rivera's house next week and make it look like Apache work. Papa laughed and said dead men don't collect wages." Santiago Rivera's weathered face went white as death, his hands trembling as he processed the implications. His daughter Isabella lived in that house with his elderly mother, the only family he had left in the world. "Boss," he said quietly, his voice carrying deadly calm that made several men step back nervously. "My family better be safe when I get back to town, or we're going to have serious words." "Of course they're safe," Boone replied, but his eyes darted toward Morrison in a way that confirmed Clara's reading rather than denying it. "Rivera, you've worked for me for 3 years. You know I keep my word to loyal men." "Do I?" Rivera asked, and his tone carried implications that made the other men shift uncomfortably, hands drifting toward their weapons. Clara could feel the bonds holding Boone's criminal organization together beginning to fray under the weight of revealed betrayals and broken promises. She flipped through more pages, finding additional damning entries that Annie had recorded with the meticulous care of someone who understood she was documenting evidence for future justice. "Here's another interesting one from last month," she continued. "Papa met with Sheriff Martinez about selling Apache reservation land to cattle buyers, but he's planning to have Martinez killed afterward to eliminate the witness. Papa said dead sheriffs can't testify in territorial courts. One of the younger gunmen, a man named Carlos, who served as liaison with the corrupt sheriff, shifted uncomfortably. Boss, Martinez is my cousin, helped raise me after my parents died. You never said nothing about killing him." "Because I'm not planning any such thing." Boone roared, but his face was now streaming with sweat despite the cool morning air. "Don't you idiots see what she's doing? She's trying to turn us against each other with lies and fabricated stories." But Clara wasn't finished. She had found the most devastating entry of all, written in Annie's careful hand just days before Clara's wedding ceremony. The words seemed to burn on the page as she read them. August 15th. Papa is planning something terrible for Jake Morrison. He told me Jake knows too many of his secrets and can't be trusted anymore. He's going to have Rivera shoot Jake during the next cattle drive and blame it on rustlers, then divide Jake's share of the money among the others to buy their silence. Jake Morrison went very still, his rifle swinging slowly toward his employer with the deliberate precision of a man who had just learned he was marked for death. That true boss, you planning to have me killed like some rabid dog? Of course not, Boone protested. But his voice now held the desperate edge of a man watching his carefully constructed empire collapse around him. Morrison, you're my right hand. I trust you completely. Funny thing is, Morrison said conversationally, his scarred face expressionless as carved stone. Rivera mentioned something last week about a special job you wanted him to do on the cattle drive. Said you'd pay extra for discretion and no questions asked. Santiago Rivera nodded grimly, pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. Said it was for the good of the operation, necessary for everyone's security. Didn't tell me it meant putting a bullet in Jake's back. The situation deteriorated rapidly as more of Boone's men began questioning their loyalty to a boss who had been systematically planning their elimination. Clara watched the criminal organization fracture along lines of suspicion and betrayal. But she knew the chaos would only last moments before Boone regained control through superior firepower or sheer vicious determination. That was when Santiago Rivera made his choice between survival and redemption. The Mexican tracker had been wrestling with his conscience for months, collecting blood money while his daughter grew up in the shadow of violence and corruption. Now learning that Boone planned to murder his family regardless of years of loyal service, Rivera saw his chance to strike back at the monster who had corrupted everything he touched, turning honest men into accomplices in evil. Instead of simply dropping his rifle or declaring his change of allegiance, Rivera acted with the swift decisiveness of a man who understood that half measures would result in everyone's death. He spun toward the wooden crates stacked near the riverbank, boxes of ammunition and gunpowder that Boone's men had brought for the extended manhunt, and fired 3 quick shots into the volatile contents with deadly accuracy. The explosion was tremendous, a roaring blast that shook the earth and sent men diving for cover as fragments of wood and metal screamed through the air like deadly hail from hell itself. The concussion knocked several gunmen off their feet, while smoke and dust filled the air in a choking cloud that turned the riverbank into absolute chaos, where no one could see friend from enemy. Rivera didn't survive his desperate gambit. Shrapnel from the exploding ammunition caught him in the chest and throat, shredding vital organs and dropping him to the muddy ground in a spreading pool of blood. But his sacrifice achieved its intended purpose. In the confusion following the blast, the careful positioning that had trapped Clara, Kohana, and Jeb completely dissolved into screaming pandemonium, where survival depended on quick thinking rather than superior numbers. Clara felt the explosion's shockwave slam into her body, like a physical blow from a giant's fist, but she forced herself to move, while Boone's men were still stunned and disoriented by the unexpected violence. The blast had thrown her guard to the ground, with blood streaming from his ruptured eardrums, his rifle spinning away into the shallow water, where it disappeared beneath muddy foam. She scrambled toward Kohana's tree on hands and knees, pulling Rivera's knife from her dress as she ran. The Mexican tracker had thrown her the blade with his final conscious act, understanding that she would need a weapon for what came next. The ropes binding Kohana's wrists had been loosened by the tree's violent shaking during the explosion. Fibers stretched and frayed by the tremendous force. Clara sawed frantically at the remaining hemp, with Rivera's sharp blade, her hands slippery with mud, and the tracker's blood that had splattered across the riverbank in crimson drops. Behind her, she could hear Boone screaming orders at his scattered men, trying to restore order to the chaos that threatened to destroy his final chance at victory and revenge. But his voice competed with ringing ears, panicked shouts, and the groans of wounded men who had been caught too close to the explosion. "Nika, can you fight?" Clara asked as the last rope parted and Kohana's arms came free circulation, returning painfully to his hands. "Yes," he replied grimly, flexing his fingers to restore feeling while assessing their tactical situation. "But we are still outnumbered by armed men who will kill us both if we hesitate or show mercy." Kohana retrieved his Winchester from where it had fallen during his capture, checking quickly to ensure the rifle hadn't been damaged by flying debris from the explosion. Around them, Boone's men were beginning to recover from the blast and reorganize under their leader's furious commands, but the advantage of surprise would last only seconds more. "Us Morrison," Boone roared through the settling dust, his voice hoarse with rage and desperation. "Bradley, kill them both right now before they can escape." But Jake Morrison was no longer taking orders from the man who had planned his murder. Instead of aiming at Clara and Kohana, he swung his rifle toward Tom Bradley, who was struggling to line up a shot at the Apache warrior through the drifting smoke. Morrison's bullet caught Bradley in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild into the river. The riverbank erupted into a vicious three-way battle as former allies turned their weapons on each other, while Clara and Kohana fought desperately for survival against overwhelming odds. The terrain worked in their favor. Muddy ground made footing treacherous for everyone, while boulders and fallen logs provided scattered cover from the crossfire that filled the air with whining lead and the screams of wounded men. Clara had never killed a human being in her 21 years of life. But she discovered that survival could strip away civilized inhibitions with terrifying speed when death came calling. When one of Boone's remaining loyalists charged toward her with a knife gleaming in his hand, she met him with Rivera's blade, the steel sliding between his ribs with shocking ease that surprised them both. The man's eyes widened in genuine surprise before he toppled backward into the muddy water, his blood mixing with the Rio Grande's current as life drained from his body. The moment stretched like eternity as Clara stared at what she had done. The first life she had ever taken claimed in desperate defense of her own existence. She felt simultaneously sick and oddly empty, as if some essential part of her humanity had been carved away by necessity. But there was no time for remorse or philosophical consideration. More men were coming, and hesitation meant death for herself and Kohana. Kohana fought with the controlled fury of a warrior, protecting something precious beyond his own life. His rifle barrel cracked skulls, and his knife found vital organs with precision learned through years of desert warfare against enemies who showed no mercy to the defeated. He didn't waste ammunition on flashy shots or unnecessary violence, but instead used every bullet to eliminate immediate threats, dropping men with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that mercy would mean death for Clara and himself. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but lasted perhaps 10 minutes of concentrated violence. When the gunfire finally faded into echoes across the water, bodies floated in the shallow river, while blood turned the mud into crimson paste that would stain the earth for months to come. Morrison lay dead with 3 bullets in his chest, killed by men who had once called him friend. Bradley had crawled into the river reeds, where he bled out slowly from his wounds, calling for his mother with his final breath. 2 other men had fled when they realized the fight was hopeless, abandoning their dead companions to save their own worthless lives. Only Silas Boone remained standing among the wreckage of his scattered empire. His clothes torn and his face streaked with mud and gunpowder burns that made him look like some demon crawled up from hell itself. But he still held his pistol in hands that shook with rage rather than fear, and his eyes still burned with the malevolent hatred that had driven him to build a kingdom of terror across the Arizona territory through 15 years of systematic brutality. "You think you've won something here?" he gasped, swaying on his feet, but keeping the weapon trained on Clara with unwavering determination. "But you haven't changed anything that matters. I've got money hidden away in banks, friends in high places who owe me favors. I'll rebuild everything you've destroyed, and then I'll come for you both. Hunt you to the ends of the earth if necessary." Clara stood in ankle-deep water with Rivera's bloody knife still gripped in her trembling hand, her wedding dress torn and filthy beyond recognition. Her blonde hair was matted with mud and gore, her face streaked with blood, both her own and that of the men she had helped kill. But her blue eyes held steel that hadn't existed when Boone first dragged her to the altar months earlier with promises of love and prosperity that had turned to nightmares before the honeymoon ended. "No," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute certainty that seemed to fill the sudden silence. "You won't." Boone's finger tightened on the trigger with deliberate slowness. But Kohana was faster and infinitely more skilled at violence. The Apache warrior's knife flew through the air with deadly accuracy, born of countless battles, burying itself to the hilt in Boone's chest, just above his heart. The rancher staggered backward, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the muddy ground as he looked down at the steel protruding from his body with genuine surprise. Should have stayed in Norway. He whispered through lips that were rapidly turning blue, then toppled forward into the muddy water where his blood joined that of his victims in the Rio Grande's eternal flow toward distant oceans. Silence settled over the riverbank, like a burial shroud, broken only by the sound of water flowing over stones, and Jeb Calloway's labored breathing as he slowly regained consciousness. The man who had terrorized Silver Wash for 15 years was finally dead, his empire of cruelty destroyed by the courage of those he had tried to break through violence and intimidation. Clara dropped Rivera's knife and sank to her knees in the shallows, exhaustion and psychological shock finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had sustained her through the battle. She had survived 7 days of desperate flight, faced down her tormentor in direct confrontation, and helped bring justice to a lawless territory through methods that would haunt her dreams for years to come. But the cost in blood and violence left her shaking with reactions she didn't fully understand, and wasn't sure she wanted to explore. Kohana waded over to her, his own wounds bleeding freely, but none life-threatening enough to prevent him from offering comfort. He had lost everything to Boone's greed, his wife, his son, his peaceful existence. But revenge had brought no peace, only empty satisfaction and the knowledge that justice sometimes required terrible prices that left survivors forever changed. "Is it over?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible above the flowing water and the distant sound of approaching riders. "Yes," Kohana replied, looking at Boone's still form floating face down among the reeds like discarded refuse. "Evil is finished. Now we must heal what we can and honor what cannot be restored." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made both of them tense hands, reaching instinctively for weapons until they recognized Annie Boone's voice, calling across the water with desperate urgency. The 15-year-old had ridden hard from Silver Wash with Father McNulty and 3 federal marshals arriving just as the battle's echoes faded into desert silence. "Clara!" Annie cried, splashing into the river without regard for her dress or the bodies floating nearby like grisly reminders of the violence that had just ended. "Are you hurt? Is my father?" "He's dead," Clara said, simply accepting the girl's embrace, while tears of relief and exhaustion streamed down both their faces. "It's finally over, Annie. You're free to live your own life now." The federal marshals surveyed the carnage with professional detachment, born of years dealing with frontier violence, recognizing the signs of a battle where desperate people had fought for their lives against overwhelming odds. Captain Hayes, the lead officer, had seen enough territorial justice to understand that sometimes the law arrived too late to prevent violence, but just in time to ensure that proper records were kept and surviving criminals faced appropriate consequences. "We'll need detailed statements from all of you," Hayes said respectfully, removing his hat as he looked at Clara and Kohana with genuine admiration. "But from what I can see here, This was clear self-defense against known criminals with outstanding warrants. Annie's journal provides all the evidence we need to close a dozen murder cases and clear your names completely. Father McNulty performed last rites over Santiago Rivera's body with genuine reverence, honoring the man who had found redemption in his final moments. Despite years of moral compromise and complicity in evil, the priest had arrived too late to prevent the violence through intervention, but his presence ensured that the dead were treated with proper dignity, regardless of their crimes or the circumstances of their deaths. As the sun set over the Rio Grande, painting the water red with reflected light that matched the blood-soaked battlefield, Clara stood beside Kohana and watched federal marshals load bodies onto horses for transport to the territorial capital, where justice would be officially recorded and certified. The chase that had begun 7 days earlier with her desperate flight into the wilderness was finally finished, but the memories would last forever. She thought of the woman who had collapsed in the desert grass, broken and terrified, begging for mercy from monsters who showed none to anyone who crossed their will. That woman was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous, a survivor who had faced the worst of human cruelty and emerged victorious through courage, alliance, and the willingness to fight for justice when law failed to protect the innocent. The wedding ring she would bury beside this river tomorrow would mark not just the end of a nightmare marriage, but the birth of a new life, built on strength rather than submission to authority. In the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory, Clara Johansson had discovered that even the most unlikely alliances could triumph over seemingly impossible odds when driven by the simple human refusal to surrender hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. 6 weeks later, Clara stood in morning sunlight outside the newly rebuilt Silver Wash courthouse, her blue dress clean and properly mended for the first time since her wedding day that now seemed like something from another lifetime entirely. The legal proceedings that had consumed the past month were finally complete. Boone's surviving associates had been sentenced to long prison terms, his ranch and assets liquidated to provide compensation for victims' families. And the territorial governor had personally commended her courage in bringing justice to the region through her testimony. But the trials had not been easy. Clara had spent hours on the witness stand facing hostile lawyers who tried to portray her as an ungrateful wife who had collaborated with savage Indians to murder innocent ranchers. She had answered every question with quiet dignity, her voice never wavering as she described the horrors of her marriage and the desperate flight that had led to the confrontation at Rio Grande. Mrs. Boone. One defense attorney had sneered, "Isn't it true that you killed a man in cold blood during this alleged battle?" Clara had looked him directly in the eyes, her voice steady as granite. "I killed a man who was trying to murder me. If defending my own life makes me a criminal, then I suppose I'm guilty as charged." The courtroom had fallen silent at her words, and even the hostile lawyer had seemed taken aback by her unflinching honesty. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning unanimous verdicts of justified homicide for all deaths at the river, while finding Boone's surviving associates guilty on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The woman facing the world that crisp autumn morning bore little resemblance to the terrified immigrant bride who had collapsed in the desert weeks earlier. Clara's face showed healthy color and proper nutrition, but more importantly, her blue eyes held steady confidence born of survival and victory against impossible odds. The scars on her feet had healed into permanent reminders of how far she had traveled both physically and spiritually from the broken woman who had once begged for mercy from monsters. Kohana stood beside her on the courthouse steps, his wounds healed, and his mission of justice completed with thoroughness that would be remembered in Apache oral tradition for generations. The warrior had testified truthfully about the battle at Rio Grande, earning not only immunity from prosecution, but official recognition as a territorial scout and guide. The federal marshals had offered him regular employment tracking criminals and protecting settlers' work that would allow him to continue fighting injustice, while supporting himself honorably in the white man's world that was rapidly displacing his people's traditional ways. Time for me to return to my people. Kohana said, his English now fluent after weeks of legal proceedings and interactions with court officials. Winter comes to the mountains, and my clan needs help preparing for the cold months ahead. Clara nodded, understanding that their partnership had served its purpose and must now end naturally, despite the bonds forged in blood and shared suffering. Kohana had his own life to rebuild among the Apache clans, while she faced important decisions about her future in this adopted homeland that had tested her so severely, yet ultimately rewarded her courage with freedom. "Will you be safe?" she asked, genuinely concerned for his welfare, in a territory where many still viewed Apache warriors as enemies to be eliminated, regardless of their service to law and order. "Safe enough," Kohana replied with a slight smile that transformed his usually serious features. "Justice has many faces, and mine is known now as protector rather than destroyer. That recognition opens doors previously closed and creates possibilities that did not exist in the old times of constant warfare." From inside the courthouse came the cheerful voice of Annie Boone, now legally Annie McNulty, in honor of the priest who had helped bring federal law to Silver Wash through his final act of courage. The 15-year-old had indeed been accepted by the Denver School for Young Ladies, but she had chosen to delay her enrollment until after all the trials concluded, wanting to see complete justice served before beginning her new life, free from her father's shadow. "Clara," Annie called, emerging from the building with several official documents clutched in her hands like precious treasures. "The territorial administrator confirmed your teaching position. The new school for immigrant women opens next month, and they want you to help design the curriculum." The job offer represented exactly what Clara needed: steady income and the opportunity to help others avoid the exploitation she had endured through ignorance and desperation. More importantly, it would allow her to remain in Silver Wash and help rebuild the community that Boone's tyranny had nearly destroyed through 15 years of systematic brutality. "Are you going to accept?" Annie asked eagerly, her young face bright with hope. The girl had formed a strong attachment to Clara during the legal proceedings, seeing in her the strong mother figure she had never known. Her own plans to attend school in Denver would be much easier to bear, knowing that Clara would be nearby when she returned for holidays and summer breaks. "I am," Clara replied with absolute certainty. "This place needs healing from everything that happened, and maybe I can be part of that process of recovery and renewal." Sheriff Martinez approached them with a telegram from the Norwegian consulate in Denver, requesting her testimony about mail-order bride fraud networks that preyed upon European immigrants seeking better lives in America. Her case had attracted diplomatic attention across multiple countries, and her testimony could help protect other vulnerable women from experiencing the horrors that had nearly cost her life and sanity. As they prepared to part ways, Kohana returning to tribal lands in the mountains, Annie departing for her new school, Clara beginning her career as educator and advocate for immigrant rights, Jeb Calloway arrived in a wagon with news that brought genuine smiles to their faces. "I thought you folks might want to know," Jeb called out cheerfully, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "They're naming the new county after Father McNulty. Territorial governor signed the papers yesterday morning. Seems fitting that a man who found his courage at the very end should have something permanent to remember him by." The news represented final poetic justice. The priest who had enabled evil through his weakness, but achieved redemption through ultimate sacrifice, would be honored by future generations who might never know the full story of his moral transformation. His name would appear on maps and official documents throughout the territory, a lasting reminder that it was never too late to choose courage over cowardice when innocent lives hung in the balance. As Clara watched Kohana mount his sturdy paint horse for the final time, she felt the approach of their parting like physical pain in her chest. They had shared experiences that few people could understand, forged bonds in the crucible of survival that transcended racial boundaries and cultural differences. "Before you go," she said, pulling a small silver locket from around her neck, "I want you to have this. It was my mother's, the only thing of value I brought from Norway. She always said it would protect whoever wore it from evil spirits." Kohana accepted the locket with reverence, understanding the significance of such a gift. In return, he reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small carved feather made from deer antler, its surface polished smooth by years of handling. "This is eagle feather," he said, placing it carefully in Clara's hands. "My father carved it when I was born, gave me strength in many battles. Eagle sees far, flies high above troubles of earth. When you wear it, remember that you have wings now, can soar above any cage men try to build around you." They embraced briefly, two survivors who had found in each other the courage to face impossible odds and emerge victorious. No words were necessary, their bond transcended language and would endure regardless of physical distance or the passage of time. Clara watched Kohana ride toward the distant mountains, where his people awaited his return, feeling a deep sense of completion settle over her spirit, like a warm blanket on a cold night. The terrified woman who had fled into wilderness 7 weeks ago had died in that desert crucible, reborn as someone infinitely stronger and more purposeful. She had found her true calling in protecting and educating other vulnerable women, while the lessons learned through suffering and triumph would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The wedding ring she had buried beside the Rio Grande remained in that muddy grave, but the strength gained through survival would stay with her forever. In the harsh landscape of the American frontier, Clara Johansson had discovered not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the extraordinary courage that ordinary people could summon when faced with impossible choices between right and wrong. As the sun climbed higher over Silver Wash, and the business of rebuilding continued with renewed hope and determination, Clara walked back into the courthouse to formally accept the teaching position that would define the next chapter of her life. Behind her, the desert stretched endlessly toward distant horizons, holding its secrets and stories in shifting sands where justice had finally been served, and healing could begin for all who had suffered under tyranny's cruel hand. The wild frontier had tested her strength and found it more than sufficient to meet any challenge. Now it was time to use that hard-won wisdom and resilience to ensure that other women would never have to face alone the terrors she had endured in the unforgiving wilderness of the Arizona Territory, where even the most unlikely alliances could triumph over the darkest evils when courage and justice finally joined forces against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious through determination and the simple human refusal to surrender hope.